For 17 years, Vicki and I lived in Hurricane Alley on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Every year it seemed like it happened, there would be a hurricane bearing down. There was forecasts of sometimes dire, sometimes not so much. And we had to make a decision of whether we were going to leave our home or not to stay away from the hurricane. And depending on severity, we usually decided to leave and come to Dallas for parents to protect ourselves. But I always remembered those strange people who decided to stay and every year they say, ride it out. Now, if you ever had a discussion with them, they always say the same thing. I've been living here for a long time. And it's not as bad as they say. It's not going to hit me after all. It may hit that farther down the coast, but it won't be us. And inevitably say, I built my house and it can stand it. And then the next thing you know, they're on the evening news being rescued by a police boat with their house as a pile of sticks in the background. All people live on an impression that something is or isn't true. We can build a house on a hillside believing a mudslide will never take place, even though we probably know it will. But it won't really happen because we convinced ourselves of that. We can decide we'll never get sick and end up in the hospital in a terrible shape. In our previous lessons, we've been exploring the idea of temptation in a Christian's life. Our desires are what attracts the temptation to us, as metal attracts a lightning bolt. Our desire flows from three different parts of our humanity: the things that we see, the desire to make our bodies feel good and to satisfy them, and the need to have control over our lives that rightly belongs to God Himself. And the devil, being the exploiter that he is, takes advantage of all of these openings, and he uses these desires to do a single thing, a single goal, to separate us from God and His will. But that doesn't seem like such a big problem. After all, we know better. We know right from wrong. We know adultery is wrong. We know that theft is wrong. We know lying is wrong. We know murder is wrong. We know right from wrong. But if we know, why then do we still succumb to temptation if we know so much? I think the answer is found in what the devil convinces us to believe. For all of us, if he convinces us to believe the lies we tell ourselves, he has us in his grasp. So what are these lies that we believe as we stumble toward disobedience? I think it's good to start by thinking about how the devil uses what we think. Due to Dante Alighieri, the Renaissance poet, we have the personification of the devil. In our minds, we have this picture of the devil in a red suit with horns coming out of his forehead, with a long tail with an arrowhead on the end of it, holding a three-pronged pitchfork. I'm afraid that when we personify the devil as a being like that, he becomes less than he really is. The nature of the devil is far worse than that. And it's really exposed in Genesis chapter 3, the story that we've been examining for many weeks about the temptation of Adam and Eve. In that passage it says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die.'" He asked what God said, even though he knew, and Eve spits back at him almost word for word what God told them. But then the devil turns and he does two things. He starts by questioning, did God actually say, you shall not eat? He lawyered the plain meaning of God into some sort of strange statement, one that men seeking to avoid God have used many times through the history of mankind. Well, God did not say we couldn't eat of it, did he? Then he added to it, you will not surely die. It's this kind of thinking the devil employs that makes Jesus so blunt with the Pharisees. In John chapter 8, he's explaining that he is of his Father and he represents God when he speaks. But the Pharisees turn their nose up at that explanation. They have a rejoinder. They say, we have pedigree. John 8:39, they say, Abraham is our father. Jesus said, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. In a way, they were saying, we can trace our lineage. Can you? Because in verse 41, they tell, we are not illegitimate children. And I suspect that's a suggestion that Jesus' entry into the world was of suspicious circumstances when Mary said, I am pregnant of the Holy Spirit. None of these men would believe that kind of lie. He's masking something, covering something up about his birth. But Jesus points out a simple fact. Children take after their parents. If you watch families walk, you can always tell the child who walks like his father. You can watch them talk and you can see the mannerisms in their hands and their faces. And if you really want to know what a parent is like, all you have to do is listen to their child strapped in the back seat of a car seat. And they'll tell you everything you need to know about their parents because they are like them. So Jesus admits to them, you got your parentage wrong. You're not Abraham's children. He goes on to say, verse 44, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. He describes the devil with one simple phrase. He is a liar and the father of lies. In Greek, the term liar is lumped together with cheat. It's all part of the same package. It means someone uses what is false to promote something as true, to get you under their spell. I like what the New International Version says. It is his native language. It is of his own. In fact, Jesus says the devil gives birth to lies. Now, we tell our children don't lie, but yet the adult sometimes puts the wrong number on the line of a tax return. There are spouses that say they were somewhere that they weren't. So it's part and parcel of humanity to listen to what the devil tells them and what the devil tells in the lies. But what makes those lies so dangerous is he blends them with enough truth to make them believable. No one believes something's unbelievable. You don't say, in the middle of Nevada, out in the desert, I've got oceanfront property. No one believes that. But if it can be twisted in such a way to make it believable, it has plausibility. The judge asked the con man when he was sentencing him for cheating people, he said, why do you cheat all those honest, trusting people? And his reply was, that's the only kind you can cheat. You ask the devil why he lies to us, he said, because they believe them. And wherever there is sin, there's always a lie behind it. A lie that the devil tells us that we choose to believe. So what kind of lies do we believe? Through the human interactions of Scripture, the lies we believe become more visible and more sharp to where we understand them. The first lie we believe is that we're stronger than we are. No one wants to project weakness. That's the human need to exhibit the pride of life. But you can read it all over Peter's face. In Mark 14, Jesus is preparing his disciples for the inevitable of the next 24 hours. His death is coming. And so he tells them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. It was a statement that stuck in the throats of the disciples. You will all fall away. It was too much for Peter. Peter said to him, even though they all fall away, I will not. He makes a strong statement using a double negative in Greek, a way to emphasize the point. He says, I will never, ever, under any circumstances, ever fall away from you. But while Peter's making his boast, the devil is smiling. He really believes that, doesn't he? He thinks he's stronger than he is, more faithful than he is, more important. He's too important to fall away. He really does believe it, doesn't he? And with his grin, the devil is correct. A few hours pass. Jesus is in the garden and he's arrested by a torch-bearing lynch mob, escorted by one of his own, Judas. And most of the disciples do exactly what Jesus predicted. They ran to the shadows to escape notice and arrest on the charge of sedition. But Peter, yeah, he was different. He wasn't scattered the way he said he would. He followed, but from afar. And he found himself in the courtyard. And there, the Palestinian night was biting his skin with his cold breeze. Suddenly, an aroma fills his nostrils, and he realizes there's a charcoal fire. And so he moves closer with the crowd to warm himself. And he's there. And the reflection of the flames dance across his face, and they draw the attention of an observant servant girl. And seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, You also were with the Nazarene Jesus. Suddenly words appeared in Peter's mouth, unbidden except from the heart, afraid of what was about to happen. But he denied, saying, I neither know nor understand what you mean. And he went out to the gateway, and the rooster crowed. He was trying to escape, hoping the worst was over. But then the girl noticed him again and said, This fellow is one of them. The them was the knife. Peter had to prove himself now. Others joined in the mass accusations. But again he denied it. After a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, Certainly you're one of them. You're a Galilean. Now fear mingled with rage took hold of Peter's heart, and he said, As God is my witness, I do not know this man. And there was the faint crowing of a rooster, thinking it was dawn. With tears burning his cheeks, he ran, trying to escape from his own weakness at the critical moment. All the devil has to do is let us believe we're better than we are. I can handle it. I'm not like them. Oh, those kind of things pose no problem for me. Oh, don't worry about that. I'm immune from that. In those times, you need to remember Achilles. Achilles was a legend told by Homer in the Iliad, who is the hero of the Trojan War. He was a warrior of great strength and great resilience. Before his birth, the oracle predicted that Achilles would be greater than his father, so at his birth, his mother wanted to make him immortal. So she dipped him in the river Styx, but in order for her to dip the boy into the water to be totally immersed, she had to hold him by his heel. And it was left untouched by the water. But what difference does a heel and a foot make in your life? And so the war began. And the Trojan War grew fierce, and Paris, the prince of Troy, shot an arrow. And even though Achilles repelled all the other assaults, the arrow struck him in his heel, the only place unprotected by the water of his birth. See, we all have an Achilles heel, a weakness that we exhibit. And the truth is that the strongest man is the one who knows his weakness, and the worst lie to believe is it cannot happen to me. That's why the warning of Paul is so important. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands Take heed lest he fall. That comes right before the verse we usually quote about temptation. He says the biggest problem with people is they think they can stand. They think they're stronger than they are. And when that happens, you need to be very, very careful lest you fall. It's a warning sign. When you start saying to yourself, don't worry, I can handle it, you probably can't. But the second lie we tell ourselves is that in some ways we deserve what we want. After all, think about we live in a society that sells on the basis that you can have what you want when you want it. Amazon has a buy now button that makes it simple. You want it, hit the button, it's yours. Very simple. McDonald's used to have a slogan they used to sell hamburgers and French fries. The slogan was very simple, and it proclaimed a human need. You deserve a break today. You deserve a break today. But they sold enough hamburgers to prove that it was true, that people believe there are things in life I deserve. It is the most used advertising strategy, and it's also one of the ones the devil employs the best. To whisper in our ears, you deserve to have this. But he adds something, and you can get it now, and he can do it easy. We find this downfall buried as an epilogue to an Old Testament story we usually employ to talk about the obedience to God. It comes from the 5th chapter of 2 Kings. The power of the world resided just north of the little nation of Israel in Syria. The Syrian army was led by a commander named Naaman. He was powerful, he was impressive, but he was flawed. He had the dreaded disease of leprosy. He hears from a servant girl that in Israel there's a prophet who can heal him. And when he goes to the king is absolutely mortified. How can I guarantee the healing of this dreaded disease? But he points him in the direction of Elisha, the prophet of God. And so he pulls his entourage up to the humble shack of the man of God, and he knocks on the door. And when the door opens, it's Gehazi, Elisha's trusted servant. Naaman says he wants to speak to Elisha, the man of God, about his disease. And all he gets is a message. Go dip in the river Jordan 7 times and you'll be clean. And the door shuts. Naaman was furious. He figured there'd be a lot of arm waving and magic chanting. Dipping in a dirty river? There were clean rivers at home. Why waste his time coming here? But that little servant girl, abducted by the army in one of the forays into Israel, quietly and politely pointed out to Naaman the obvious. If he had asked you to do something great, you would have done it. Why should you not do something simple? This quiet advice drove Naaman to the Jordan River, where he got in, and he dipped 1, 2, 3, 6, and the leprosy was still there. And finally, 7. And as the water rolled off of his skin, it was smooth, and the leprosy was gone. And he was grateful. He wanted to at least reward Elisha for his kindness. He comes back, knocks on the door, and in Naaman's hand is a bag of silver. And he says, you should have this. But Elisha refuses. This is not a financial transaction. And with that, the door closes on Naaman again. But something is stirred, not in Elisha, not in Naaman, but in someone who is in the house listening. It's Gehazi. He has served Elisha for several years. He's been faithful, and that faithful service has left him in poverty. There were days without food. He and his children are wearing rags for clothes. They feel deprived. And he did not mind, but now at least he could be polite and take the money. It couldn't hurt, and we need it. And after all, don't we deserve something better than this? And after all, what's the difference? He's just a Syrian. We're just taking his money. We can use the money. I need it. I like it. I want it. All of those thoughts tumble through the mind of Gehazi. We know that because he's so human. So Gehazi has a plan. It says, when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, see, my master has spared Naaman the Syrian, is not expecting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. Notice the pronouns, I will. So Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, is all well? And he said, well, all is well. My master has sent me to say, they have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim, 2 young men, the sons of prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. And Naaman said, be pleased to accept 2 talents. If you wanted 1,000, I'll give you $2,000. And he urged him to tie up the silver into 2 bags with the 2 changes of clothing, and laid them on 2 of his servants, and they carried them before Gehazi. When they came to the hill, he took them from their hand and put them in the house and sent the men away, and they departed. The problem with sin is when you listen to a lie, you usually have to tell one to cover it up. And that's what Gehazi did. He went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said to him, where have you been, Gehazi? Gehazi said, your servant went nowhere. Yet guilt cannot escape the notice of God and his spokesman. But Elisha said, did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Elisha says, I know where you were, and I know what you were doing. Then he tells Gehazi, look at his hands. Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper like snow. Gehazi's fatal flaw was he believed that he deserved something better and that he can get it now. When we tell ourselves we deserve something or need it or want it, we'll justify the means we use to get it. For Gehazi, he was tired of living like everyone else in poverty. So if he could have something now and be somebody important, what was a little lie here and now between friends? And we convince ourselves that we deserve to be happy. We do whatever it takes to make me happy. Marriages are broken up because someone says, but doesn't God want me to be happy? See right and wrong dim compared to the desire to have what I want now without waiting. And you've coupled that with a society whose ethics have changed to the ends justify the means. And we can easily cross the lines and think, God will forgive me. He won't care. But you see, the premise of all idolatry is that one very thing, that we can have what we want now when we want it. The Greek and the Romans invented their gods, but interestingly, the gods that they cast into the mold were what men really wanted. Brazen lust, raw power, the ability to steal, to kill, to wreak destruction, to be vengeful. And when you worship a God like that, you become like that. And if the devil can convince you that your desires and wishes are all that is important, it's a short walk to the sin that gets in, which leads to the third lie we tell ourselves. There are no consequences. We have some interesting language we have developed in our lives and our society. One of those is called the victimless crime. If no one gets hurt, then nothing is wrong. Or is said in short ways, no harm, no foul. Oh, Satan loves that one. You don't have to pay for sin. It's his best one. It's his first one. Because at the base of the story is that simple concept. I had a friend who loved to tell the story of Genesis chapter 3. He called his lesson the knot in the devil's tail. But he told it slowly and methodically, almost too much so, because he had you thinking of all the mental spellings of certain words. And in your mind, the word knot was spelled K-N-O-T, like the knot in a rope, and tail was T-A-I-L, like the tail of a dog. And that's how you thought about it. And that's what's made the story interesting. I didn't know the devil had a knot in his tail. But when you read the story, you see the knot in the devil's tail. And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." It's not the exchange that is bad. The question, did God say you can't eat of any tree in the garden, was asked. The answer is no, that's not what he said. Eve had it right. We may eat of the trees except for the tree in the midst of the garden. Then she tells of the consequences that God laid down. If you touch it, you will die. And that was the devil's chance. The lie he could tell you. You shall not surely die. In fact, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Do you see it yet? The knot in the devil's tail is the word knot in the tail he told Eve. And the knot promised them that there were no bad consequences to suffer. All sin is criminal thinking, because a criminal says, I can do that and get away with it. It's just a little thing nobody will notice. Bruce Barton once remarked, sometimes when I consider what tremendous consequences come from little things, I'm tempted to think there are no little things. After all, it's this kind of thinking that drove David to close the door with Bathsheba in the room, or to hand the orders of death to Joab. There's that thought, no one will ever know. I will not have to suffer. I will not have to pay. But the truth of life is it has consequences. It's part of the system. Paul told the Galatians, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that shall he also reap. Just as the seed is dropped into the ground, it does something in the future, unseen. Suddenly something comes up you didn't see before. That's what sin does. It drops a seed into the eternal soil, which suddenly pops up, and you see it later. Sometimes it takes a long time. You may not know the name Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a truck mechanic in Roseville, California for many years. Perhaps he thought time had forgotten him. But in June of this year, he pled guilty to the heinous crimes of rape and at least 13 murders. And they happened 50 years ago. And he had disappeared since then, living a quiet, calm life in a little town in California, as if nothing had happened. The consequences were only delayed, not forgotten. And without consequences for sin, sinning continues. But there are consequences. To believe otherwise is to believe the lie. See, one consequence, if nothing else, guilt will build inside of that will destroy a life. But there are some consequences that are laid that perhaps never even show up in our lives. But they do show up in a judgment. Paul told Timothy the sins of some people are conspicuous, going before them to judgment. But the sins of others appear later. Hebrew writer emphasized the same concept when he writes to his audience, "For we know him who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay.' And again, the Lord will judge his people." It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. There will come a day where payment will be demanded. The devil only tells us lies we're willing to believe, not something we want. We desperately want to believe that we're better than we are. And that's the point where we slip. We deserve, we say, what dangles in front of us. Just as a fish is caught by the bait and the next stop is the frying pan, so too are those who get caught with the lie that I deserve it. And no matter what the devil tells you, you will pay in some way for disobeying God. So how do we keep from believing a lie? First, get real clear about yourself. Realize that you have an Achilles heel, maybe several. There are places, perhaps many, where you are not strong. And in those weak places, you will be attacked. And even if you think you are stronger than you are, you need to start keeping a running inventory of the times that you weren't as strong as you thought, because it will give you perspective. You need to remember you're not Superman, you're human. As the tombstone of Benjamin Franklin said, the body of B. Franklin Printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here. Food for worms. Inevitably, that's what we are, food for worms. We're not as strong as we think we are. We're not as good as we think we are. And once you realize that you are weak, you become much more careful. But secondly, get clear on God. There are reasons we find ourselves succumbing to temptations that we really are not clear about what God really did say or really about who God is. We tend to say God doesn't care, but we haven't really examined that out very far. Or we say that God will just forgive and not worry about it. We haven't looked at that one very closely. And remember, the devil's a very good lawyer who can twist what you think God said into what God did not say. So you better know exactly what the truth is, both about what God says and who God is. You need to study it and you get it true in your life and your heart. And that way, at least if you're going to fall into sin, you have fallen into it knowing what you did. And it's important to know the difference between a lie and a falsehood, between the real and the fake. Joseph Shea knows what's real and what isn't. Now, you probably don't know his name, but you may have seen a character who portrayed him. He is a Secret Service agent who pursued Frank Abagnale Jr. across Europe and the United States. And the story is told in the movie Catch Me If You Can. Abagnale was a notorious forger who lived on his forgeries. But Shea knew when a check was forged, when the signature was wrong, when the paper was too light. And for many years, he chased Abagnale across Europe and the United States and finally caught him in France. But it was difficult to do that because it took someone who was paying such close attention that they knew the lie from the truth. And that's true about us. We must become the spiritual experts of being able to see the genuine from the false if we hope to avoid the devil's deceit. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next Sunday.